Ladies and gentlemen, if you can please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, if you can please take your seats. Our program will begin in a minute. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amila Golich, and I'm Assistant Director of Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. The Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by the individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. We'd like to thank our members in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. If you're not yet a member, please do consider joining. We have a variety of levels for you to choose from. Please silence your phones, but not your voices. This event is live and on the record, and we encourage your social media engagement. Later, we'll be taking questions through microphones around the room, as well as online through chi.cnf.io. Finally, before I turn it over to our speaker, a few words about him. Martin Feldstein is the George F. Baker Professor of Economics at Harvard and President Emeritus of the National Bureau of Economic Research. In his long and distinguished career, he has served in advisory roles in both Republican and Democratic administrations, including as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors and President Reagan's chief economic advisor. He's the recipient of numerous honorary degrees and awards, including the John Bates Clark Medal, which is awarded to the best economist under the age of 40. He continues to write regularly for the Wall Street Journal and other outlets, as well as publish economics research. I will return to moderate the Q&A, but for now, please join me in welcoming Professor Martin Feldstein to the Council.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be back at a Chicago Council event, something that I did some years ago and enjoyed very much. So today I'm going to talk about three subjects. So let me summarize what I'll be saying. First, I want to talk about the current state of the U.S. economy, which is really excellent, picture perfect. Then I want to talk about the problem of mismeasuring economic growth, explaining why our economic growth is actually faster than the official statistics imply. And then third, I want to explain why I think our economic condition is very fragile, why there is a serious risk of a downturn, and if that happens, why it will be difficult to recover. So let me start with the current excellent state of the economy. The unemployment rate, 4.1%. Most of us didn't think you could get unemployment down that low, and for college graduates, it's about half that, 2.3%. Last Friday, we had a monthly announcement from the Labor Department of the increase in employment, 313,000, an amazing number. People rejoining the labor force so that the labor force participation rate is continuing to increase. The inflation rate, despite this low level of unemployment, the inflation rate remains very low. The consumer price index, 2.2% higher than it was a year ago. And if you leave out the volatile food and energy component, it's just 1.8%. Household wealth has been rising very rapidly, not just for people who are share owners, but also for homeowners. House prices have been rising in real terms at a significant pace. So not surprisingly, consumers are very happy. If you look at the Michigan survey of consumer satisfaction, consumer sentiments, you see that it's at a level that hasn't been seen for some 14 years. Although retail sales were recently weak, I think they will turn around in the months ahead because of the strong income, the low unemployment, and the sense of continued moving in that direction. So that's the sense in which I think our current economy is really in excellent shape. If we could continue to have such low unemployment, such low inflation, such rising inflation, a rising wealth, I think we would all be very happy. But let me turn to the second thing that I want to talk about, and that is the fact that the growth of the economy is faster than the official statistics imply. I continually hear statements like, real incomes haven't increased for 10 years, or average real personal incomes are lower now than they were a decade or 20 years ago. And I think that doesn't make sense. And so I've started looking into how the government estimates those numbers. And I would say, having looked at it very carefully and talked with the people at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Bureau of Economic Affairs, I would say that the reality is much better than the official statistics, that all of the measures of growth understate the true actual increases. So that's true of GDP, it's true of productivity, and it's true of personal incomes. Now, I'm not talking about the recent decline. There's a lot of concern about the fact that productivity has declined in the last few years. I don't have an explanation for that. But what I do want to explain is that the rate of growth of real incomes, real GDP, real productivity has been underestimated, not just recently, but for a long period of time. Now, when I think about our real incomes, I think the source of improvements, the source of increases in our real incomes comes not from having more of the same old stuff, but from having better stuff and having new stuff, new products, new services. And unfortunately, the official government estimates of the contribution of quality change and of new products, new services, is really very poor. But let me try to explain why I've come to that conclusion. Let's talk first about quality change. And I'll talk about it in terms of manufactured products, but it's true as well for services. So the government keeps a long list of products, and they go to the manufacturer and they say, did you change your product since last year? And if the manufacturer says, yes, it's a different product than it was a year ago, the government statisticians say, well, how much more does it cost to make this year's product than it would cost to make last year's product now? And if the manufacturer says, well, it doesn't cost any more, we just found ways of making a better product, what do you think the BLS concludes? They conclude there's been no quality change. So that's nonsense. So just to say it again, the official government statistics say if the cost of producing a product hasn't gone up, then it can't be a better product. Well, we know that that's not true. As economists, we think about technical progress as the ability to create better products without increasing costs, or products in which the increase in the value to the customer is substantially more than the cost involved. So they miss that, and therefore that important source of our increasing real incomes, real GDP, and real productivity is left out because the government statisticians don't really deal with the value to the user, but only look at the cost to the producer. What about new products? Well, new products, the official treatment of new products is even worse. They don't try. Now, I don't say all this to be critical of the BLS. This is a very hard problem. I don't know how to solve it. I've thought about organizing research to try to solve it, and then in the end I threw up my hands and said, no, it's too hard. But I'll come back to that. How do they deal with new products? Well, an example that I like to give is the pharmaceutical product statins, the nice little pills that many of us take in order to reduce the risk of heart attacks, reduce the risk of strokes. And when that drug came on the market, grew very rapidly, became the largest selling class of drugs. So how did the government deal with it? Well, it put it into nominal GDP, nominal output, but it didn't do anything to take into account the value to individuals of the reduced risk of heart attacks, the reduced risk of strokes, didn't do anything to take into account the reduced cost to the healthcare system that comes as a result of the availability of statins. And that's just typical of all new products. The government doesn't try to figure out how much they're worth to the user. It simply adds them to nominal GDP. So when you put these two things together, on the one hand, the incorrect measurement of quality change, and at the same time, the complete ignoring of the effects of new products, you can see why I say that there's a substantial underestimation of the rise in real incomes, real GDP, and real productivity. Now, how much? I don't know. I would say it's at least up 2 percentage points, but I don't have hard evidence for that. But if that number is right, and I think for the reasons that I've described, it could be even more than that. If that number is right, then statements that are supported by the official statistics, that real incomes have increased at a rate of only about 1%, would in reality be more like 3%. That makes a tremendous difference over time. So let me turn to the third subject that I wanted to talk about, and that is the fragility of the U.S. economy. That is the increased risk of an economic downturn. Why do I think we have that? Well, basically it's because of the abnormally high asset prices caused by the excessively easy monetary policy over the last decade. The Federal Reserve, when the downturn occurred in 2007 and 2008, the Federal Reserve cut the short-term interest rate, the federal funds interest rate, almost to zero, 15 basis points, less than 0.25%. And it kept it there until just about 2 years ago. And now it's been very gradually raising it. But even today, the federal funds short-term interest rate is only about 1.25%. That means in real terms, it's negative. So it's been negative all along. And with the negative real interest rate, investors seeking a positive return someplace have bid up share prices. And so we see share prices and the prices of commercial real estate have gone up way above their historic norms. If you consider equity prices for a moment, and think about the Standard & Poor's 500 price-earnings ratio, that price-earnings ratio is today about 70% higher than it has been historically, 70% higher than it's been historically. Now, that's not out of line with where long-term interest rates are, since the 10-year Treasury interest rate now is about 2.9%. In real terms, that means it's about 0.9%, while historically, in real terms, it would be well over 2%. So we have long-term bond rates which are abnormally low, short-term interest rates abnormally low, and the combination of those has pushed up the value of equities. What's going to happen next? Well, I think what's going to happen next is going to be an increase in the interest rates, both short-term and long-term. The Federal Reserve is committed to gradually raising short-term interest rates, something that, in my judgment, they should have started doing about 3 years ago, but they didn't. And so as a result, we still have these very low interest rates, negative real interest rates. But they have said they will probably move the rate up 3 times this year by 1/4 of a point each time, so that at the end of the year, it will be about 2%. But at 2%, we'll probably still have a negative real federal funds rate. But it will be beginning to push up rates all along the spectrum. Long rates will rise as well. So that's one of the reasons why I think we can expect to see long-term rates rising. A second reason is inflation. Inflation is gradually picking up, but with this very low unemployment rate, and with employers, every employer I talk to says the same thing. It's hard to get employees. We're forced to raise wages more. And I think in reality, in addition to raising wages, there are retention bonuses, there are sign-up bonuses. None of those show up in the official statistics for what's happening to wages. But with rising wages, I think that'll get translated into rising prices, into higher inflation. And that will push up interest rates. And the third thing, and the one that may be most important, is that the real interest rates, not the inflation component, but the real interest rates will get pushed up by the large fiscal deficits. The U.S. had a debt to GDP ratio, the ratio of government debt to GDP, of around 35 or 40% until about a decade ago. And since then, it has more than doubled. So we now have a debt to GDP ratio, of about 75%. And the forecasts are that under current law, taking into account the tax law that was changed last year and some of the spending that was done this year, we're on our way to 100% by the end of the decade. But I think current law will not continue. I think the small increases in defense and non-defense discretionary spending will be expanded going forward. And I think that the prospect that the personal income tax reductions will come to an end before the end of the decade, I don't think that will happen. I think they will also go up. So I suspect we're going to be looking at even larger deficits, even larger increases in debt over the coming year. So when I put all of that together, a Fed that is tightening, inflation that's rising, and increased borrowing by the government, moving from borrowing in the last few years at about 3% of GDP to 5% of GDP. When you put it in those terms, it sounds small, but 60 billion to 100 sounds very different. So I think we're looking at substantial increases in government borrowing, pushing up the cost of bonds, pushing up the cost of interest. So when all that happens, I think we're going to see the long-term, the 10-year interest rate at 4+% rather than the 2.8% that we have now. That's good for those of you who like to own bonds, adds to the income. But in terms of the equity market, those higher interest rates, I think, can have the adverse effect of forcing a normalization of equity prices. So what happens if the S&P 500 price-earnings ratio goes from where it is today, 170% of the historic average, back just to average? Not below, just back to average. That would be a reduction of about 40%. In terms of household wealth, that would take $10 trillion out of household wealth. It's a lot of money. But takes $10 trillion out of household wealth based on past experience, based on past relationships. That would cut consumer spending by about 2% of GDP. If you take 2% of GDP out from consumer spending, there'd be some knock-on effects in terms of business investment. we would be in at least a mild recession. Now, we've had a lot of recessions over the years, and we've gotten out of them typically pretty quickly. The recession in 08 was really very different. That was not just a plain vanilla small decline in demand. It was reflective of dysfunctional financial markets, a breakdown of the banking system. But if we go into a more normal economic downturn, well, historically, we would come out relatively quickly because the Federal Reserve would cut short-term interest rates very sharply. In 2008, it cut them by 5 percentage points. Fed can't cut them now by 5 percentage points because the interest rate is now less than 2%, and even if we get to next year, it'll still be in the order of 2.5%. So if we do have a downturn sometime in the next 18 months or 2 years, it would come at a time when the Fed really doesn't have the ability to cut interest rates to stimulate the economy. It could, in principle, go back to buying more bonds, but that would be small relative to the very large amount of bonds that the government is selling. The government will be selling roughly $1 trillion a year of bonds. So some purchases by the Fed really wouldn't do much to change the outlook. So will the Fed, will the government turn to fiscal policy and say, let's see if we can do a better job than we did in 2009 in stimulating demand by some combination of tax cuts and spending increases? Or would they say, we've got such a large deficit, we've got so much debt coming along that we don't want to do that. And so the political process may not deliver on that. So I fear that if we do have a downturn, that if this fragility turns into a downturn, that it's going to be hard to get out, and it will be a slower, longer recovery than we've had in the past. Well, I hate to end on that sad note, but that's where I am going to end, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. Please wait for me to call on you, and please make sure that your question is a question, not a statement. So we will start here up front in the second row. If you can just give us 1 second for the mics. Here in the second row, please. She's coming on your right side.
Thank you. How long do you think productivity statistics and GDP statistics have been underestimated for? Does it go back even, say, 100 years?
Well, we probably didn't have those statistics then. GDP was only created in the 1940s. But I would say the problems that I'm describing have been permanent problems. So it's not something recent. I went to the OECD a few months ago, and I said, well, how do the people in Europe deal with this? And they've got a group of experts who follow what happens in productivity measurement and GDP measurement in these other countries. And they say, well, everybody does it out of the same playbook. So the same kind of biases that are built in here are built in France or Germany or elsewhere. So I think it's a serious problem. We don't have a good way of dealing with it. But it bothers me every time I hear somebody saying the economy isn't growing, people aren't any better off, because it's wrong.
Okay, we'll go right there in the sixth row.
Thank you, Professor. So the question is how increase the demand? You think AI will help increasing the demand? And as the aging population and birth rate is diminishing, how that will play out in long run? Thank you.
So I don't think we have a shortage of demand. After all, the unemployment rate is 4%, and the savings rate, the opposite of spending, the savings rate has essentially collapsed. If you go back to the period from 1960 to 1980, the average saving, household saving as a share of household disposable income, that number varied between 10 and 15%. Now, 3%. So Americans are spending, not saving, and our problem, if anything, is how to increase savings in this country so we can finance more investment.
Great. We actually have a question online related to this. So how do you think young savers will fare in such a slow-moving economy? Do you have any savings or investing suggestions for millennials?
No. Not going to make.
That's not good.
Not going to give advice. Not going to give advice.
Okay. We will, let's see. Let's go to this side here in the back. Perfect.
The Atlanta Fed has the GDP Now model, and the New York Fed has the Nowcast models. Do they provide any insights on GDP, or are they just mapping GDP?
No, they're just using the conventional measure of GDP. So they're not trying to change the way they measure the GDP, not trying to adjust for these quality differences and new products.
Okay, we'll go down the center aisle here in the back.
I recently heard the head of Bottom Line, I think his name is Gunlick, speak, and he said that if interest rates went as high as 3%, the Chinese would push them back down. And I'm not an economist, so I didn't understand why or what you thought of that.
Well, they're almost there, 2.9% for 10-year numbers. I don't know what he meant. I can imagine he meant that somehow if interest rates rose a lot, the Chinese would invest in those securities. That would push up the price of those securities and therefore push down the yield on them. But I don't see that happening. So.
Okay, we'll take another question from this side in the front row from Mr. Avner Porat.
Thank you for your description. You mentioned two items that concern me a little. One is that income is okay, but the second one, the savings are disappearing. How concerned are you that this will increase the inequality and affect primarily the non-shareholders, or the bottom 80%?
So who does saving in the U.S.? Who are the ones who used to save more and are not saving today? And this is household saving, but it includes contributions made by employers into 401k plans and other kinds of things. So the bottom 80% of the income distribution just doesn't do much saving. And they haven't been doing much saving even in the past. I don't know enough about who was doing that 10 to 15% back in the 60s and 70s. But as people have more and more confidence in Social Security, I think they feel less need to save for their own old age. So people save because they're going to start a business. They save because they want to buy a house. There are a lot of good reasons to save. But for people in the bottom 80 percentile, there's very little reason to save for retirement.
So we have another related question online. Should we raise the retirement age?
Yes. So let me explain a little bit more. Social Security is in serious trouble. I mean, the taxes that are collected to pay the benefits are not going to be able to cover the benefits in the future. Moreover, Social Security is creating the kinds of savings problems that I described. Well, back in 1983, the Reagan administration and the Congress agreed to increase the age for full benefits from 65 to 67. Now, that was a brave thing to do. They were brave, but not suicidal. So they didn't do it overnight. They said anybody who is retired or anybody who is close to retirement will not be affected by this. So it'll start a number of years into the future and then happen only very, very gradually. So in fact, we are still phasing in the increase in the full retirement age that was enacted back in 1983. We're still phasing it in today. So I think they should do that again. And why do I think they should do it? Because between 1983 and now, we have seen an increase in life expectancy for people in their mid-60s by another 3 years. So if 67 was a good age for full benefits back then, I think that 70 would be a good age now. And I would say it would be best if we could just make it automatic so that the Social Security Administration would look at the life expectancy for somebody in their 60s and automatically adjust that. I don't think I could run for office in the AARP with that view, but I think it will help to keep Social Security alive, and it will reduce our deficits.
Okay, we'll go back out to the audience, and we'll go in the middle here. Right there.
Thanks for the speech. My question is, what is the domestic economic impact facing that our current incumbent is going to implement the trade protection policy?
The trade protection policy, I don't know if everybody could hear her question, what's the domestic economic impact? It's not good, and it's not terrible. It has a small negative effect on the U.S. economy. If we don't get into a trade war, if we don't have a series of we'll hit you and you hit me until we have escalated this to doing a lot of damage. The U.S. economy, the labor market works very well, so if people lose their job in this industry or that industry, they will eventually find other jobs, but the transition is painful, and the transition involves losses. So I think that if you ask, assuming that these 20% tariffs on steel and 10% tariffs on aluminum are put in place, that will raise the cost of steel using and aluminum using companies, and that will have some adverse effects. But the calculations are that the job loss associated with that is a lot less than the 1 month job gain that we just had announced on Friday.
Okay, we are going to go to the fourth row in the front here. Sir, sorry, if you can just hold on. There's another question behind you, and then we'll come to you afterwards. Thank you. It's on.
Is it? There we go. Okay. Thank you for being here. My question is from your recent past. AIGFP, what were the root causes? And looking back on your directorship, do you think it could have been anticipated the kind of contagion that would occur in a larger parent company?
It's a long time ago. I was a director of AIG, and what happened was that it wasn't just AIG, it was financial companies in general, banks in general, that lost faith in each other. And so AIG couldn't go to the capital market and be able to keep funding itself. The banks said, well, I'm not sure whether that bank has any money, so I'm not going to give them any credit. And so the whole system was imploding. And it was a very serious problem. I think the government at the time did a remarkably good job of making all this work. And the worrying thing going forward, there's an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal, I think, today about what would happen if we had Bear Stearns happening once again. And the answer is, at least this is part of the answer, that the Dodd-Frank legislation took away from the Federal Reserve the ability to do the kinds of things that they did to deal with the problem back then. So we have to hope it doesn't happen again. So it's a different kind of crisis than what I was talking about in my prepared remarks, But if it happened, we wouldn't, again, the Fed wouldn't be in a position to do the kind of bailouts that they did back then.
Okay, so we're going to go to the second row, please. A mic is coming to you.
The federal debt, your scenario is that it would tend to grow and the interest rate would tend to go up, and there wouldn't be a way to stop it.
Oh, there's a way to stop it, but we'll come back to that.
All right, you'll tell me the way. Under those conditions, you would have a compounding of a downward spiral, which eventually would put the government and everybody else out of business, because if you take the 3 or 4% on the roughly 20 or $21 billion, and that which isn't on the balance sheet, you get an interest expense for the budget, which takes up the whole budget. But you're going to tell me how to get out of this. So
Yes, it's called entitlement reform. That's where the money is. 2/3 of the increase in spending over the next decade is going to be in Medicare and Social Security. So as long as you don't turn me over to AARP, I'll say that's what has to be done. Again, we don't have to cut anybody's benefits, but I think we have to slow the growth of benefits, and I think that's something we could do. You know, on the Medicare side, I talked about Social Security and raising the age. On Medicare, I find it surprising that I am covered by Medicare Part A. I pay nothing for that, no premium, nothing. That's very strange. So why should people who are earning, who have high incomes, pay nothing for their in-hospital benefits? That's what Medicare Part A is. And I think we could gradually introduce a payment requirement for people who are capable of paying it.
Would it be enough to reverse the downward spiral?
Here's the magic about the spiral. If you want to know what's going to happen to the debt to GDP ratio, you do the following calculation. You look at the annual deficit and you divide it by the growth of nominal GDP. So nominal GDP is likely to grow at about 4%. So if we reduce the deficit to less than 4%, it'll start coming down. It'll come back from this 100% to 75%. If we get the deficit down to 2%, then the debt to GDP ratio will be heading gradually, but will be heading to 50%. So it is not an insurmountable problem, but it does take some doing.
Okay, and we'll go down to the center here.
Hi, thank you. So you mentioned the difficulties in measuring quality and newness. If we look at our economy, the growth of electronics and digital is probably one of the biggest aspects. I'm wondering, in your research, how much of that accounts for what you're talking about, and what alternatives might we have for capturing that in consumer surplus or other kinds of measures?
So I don't know how to do it. As I said, I thought hard. As was said when I was introduced, I used to run the National Bureau of Economic Research. That's the kind of problem that the National Bureau should want to tackle, but I think it is in some ways too hard. But in addition to the problems I said about measuring, one of the things that I didn't realize until I started working on this is that a basic rule for GDP measurement is that the transaction that has to go through the market. If it's free, it doesn't exist. That's crazy. So all of the good free stuff that I get, my Google searches, my Facebook, all of that is just left out completely. And I think that has grown dramatically. And therefore, it may have slowed things down even more in recent years.
Okay, and we'll go to the front row on this side, please.
Do you have any thoughts on the replacement of Larry Kudlow for Gary Cohn, and I guess your old job?
No, it's not my old job, no. Larry Kudlow, they announced today, or President will announce tomorrow, will take over Gary Cohn's job. That job didn't exist when I was there. So I was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors and the President's chief economic advisor. Then in the Clinton administration, Bob Rubin became the head of the NEC, the National Economic Council, which was then thought of not so much as an advising role to the president, but as a place that would bring together different departments when there was a conflict or an issue. And so that's where Larry Kudlow is going, to that job. He's a good economist. He was the chief economist of the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, during the Reagan years. He apparently has been critical of the trade policies, but the president seems to be willing to live with that. After all, it wasn't the president firing Gary Cohn, it was Gary Cohn quitting because he, at least arguably, because he couldn't get his advice accepted. So, boy, if everybody who couldn't get their advice accepted in the administration quit, there wouldn't be anybody left.
Well, since we're addressing personnel changes, the question online that's received the most votes so far is, what do you think of Jay Powell, and how would you assess his approach to policy in comparison to Janet Yellen?
He's been on the job for how many weeks now? So we've got, it'll take time to learn. Jay Powell's appointment is unusual because he's not an economist, and almost all of the Federal Reserve presidents have been economists. But he's not inexperienced. He's been a member of the Federal Reserve Board for about 5 years. He spent time in the Treasury, so he knows a lot about these issues. On the other hand, he is not an economist, and monetary policy is a complicated technical issue. By reputation, he is going to follow the same general guide that Janet Yellen did, gradually increasing rates, although he is said to be more of a deregulator than she was. But the real question in my mind is what the Fed will do when the economy gets in trouble. And we know what the playbook is. The normal playbook says the economy turns down, you cut rates sharply. Now, the Fed was slow in doing that in 2008. But they eventually did it, and did it with a vengeance, and then they did other things, buying back government bonds, promising to keep rates low. But I think in the current environment, those policies won't work. So I think that Jay Powell has a big challenge ahead of him.
Okay, we're going to go to the side right there.
Thank you. If the underreporting of growth has continued since more or less the beginning, whether it's been constant or not, if it's continued going all the way back, doesn't the fact that growth was, say, 3.5% some years ago and is now 2% suggest that there's been some decline, whatever the baseline was?
That certainly could be true. We certainly had a surge in productivity growth for a number of years, and that has turned around, and productivity growth, as officially measured, has come down. So I don't know to what extent the measurement problems explain this slowdown, or whether it's something that's real, that we had a surge in productivity for half a dozen years, and then that came off. So I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, we're going to go to the third row.
What about the measure problem with inflation? Because we know that the inflationary basket of goods that's used is not always representative. Right now, for example, when we look at healthcare or childcare, that doesn't play a big enough role for a lot of families. Do we look, or do we have an underreporting of inflation?
Well, there are a variety of official indexes of inflation that the government produces. So they try to do it for a typical family, urban family with 2 children, but you can get other indexes. But again, it doesn't properly deal with the quality issue. So in a sense, we are overstating inflation. If you ask, what's happening to the real income, to the standard of living, you would want to look at the growth of money income and compare it to the inflation rate. And if I'm right that the standard of living is going up more rapidly because people can buy better products and new products, then we're overstating the, quote, true inflation.
I think we had another question here up front.
I seem to be reading more editorials and more articles about the fact that the free enterprise system is not doing the job.
Depends on what you read.
Well, that's right. As witnessed by, the concentration of wealth and also the high welfare payments. And what do you say to the person who is recommending socialism replace the free enterprise system? And I'm willing to see you explode, but I am not recommending that.
No. Part of the case for doing that is look how badly our free enterprise system is doing in raising real incomes. If the average family income hasn't increased in real terms for 10 years, there must be something wrong. So the optimists say, yes, we need to have more training, we need to have more capital investment, and I agree with both of those. But I think the premise is wrong. I think the premise that the economy is not delivering improvements in real standard of living, I think for the reasons that I talked about, I think that's just wrong.
A related question from our online audience. How do we address systematic wealth and income inequality?
So let's take wealth inequality. I can't remember the precise numbers, but the top, say, 10% has the overwhelmingly large share of wealth. Wealth measured by stocks and bonds, by home ownership, by traditional assets. But what's left out? What is wealth? Wealth is a way of providing for your own old age. And so how do most people do that? They do it by depending on Social Security. So they pay money in, and they anticipate correctly that when they get to be 65 or 62 or 67, they'll begin to get Social Security benefits. And the value of Social Security benefits in the aggregate for everybody is really very, very large. So that's not taken into account by these statistics. So the statistics on the inequality of wealth refer not to the kind of assets that people will support people in their old age, but rather the financial assets. So I think we get, again, a very misleading picture of what's going on in terms of the concentration of wealth.
Thank you. Okay, we have questions from this side, right here.
Hi, I have a boring technical / execution type of question. So let's say in this ideal world, we wake up tomorrow and then all these ideas you have are implemented and we start measuring these key economic indicators differently. I was wondering, how exactly do you execute something like that? And then all these financial institutions companies like the one I work for, government agencies that use this data historically to create forecasts to predict how would they implement something like that? And then a follow-up question would be, what is the appropriate rate of change for how we measure these key economic indicators? So agree that we can't do it every 50 years, but is 5 years a good time?
So the short answer, as I said, is I don't know how to do it. So it's not a question of technical execution or the speed of doing it. I don't know how, and I have talked to other economists, both here and elsewhere, to see if we could put together a plan for trying to improve these things, and I think it's just too hard. So my main message to people is stop crying about the fact that there's no growth, because I think that's not right. So we know that it's underestimated. We don't know exactly by how much, but certainly statements of the sort, there's been no real growth of middle class incomes for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, that's just not right, because it doesn't take into account new products and product improvements.
We'll go to the front here.
Hello. Recently, I've been reading some articles that are talking about how profits have been persistent for certain companies for longer periods of time than have normally than that there have normally been in the past. Do you think that that's having an impact on growth at all? Do you think that there is enough competition in the economy as it stands right now?
I don't know the specific statistics that you're referring to, but I think in terms of competition in manufactured products, because we are part of a global system, there's much more competition than there would have been 20 years ago before we had Korea, China, and others producing manufactured products. Automobiles used to be the big three. I don't know how many there are now who are selling cars in the United States, but we see a lot of foreign cars entering our market. So I think competition has increased.
Okay, and we'll go to this side over here, please.
Do you have any ideas on how to calculate the underground economy in America? Bloomberg did something like that a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question. How much income is there that's not taken into account? So now some of it is by convention. We don't take into account anything that isn't sold in the market. But there's a lot of underground activity that is not. I don't know how much trust to put in any of the estimates. The typical way that it's done is by looking at currency and circulation. But there's less and less use of currency in daily transactions. So I don't think that tells me a lot. So I don't have a good idea of how to think about the size of the underground economy.
And in the very back right there.
I have a question regarding the tariffs that were just put on, and this is something I've always wondered about. When they put these tariffs on, like they put on aluminum and steel recently, have there been any studies just from days gone by that shows that that has been an incentive for people, let's say, to buy American as opposed to buy foreign?
I don't think the tariffs have actually been put on yet. They're still in the talking phase about phasing it in and so on. Did you want? So past history. Yes, I think we know that if you put tariffs in place, especially tariffs as large as 20%, that's going to raise the price of those products. So yes, I think historic evidence would suggest that this would have some effect. I'm not sure that it's ever going to happen. I think it's a negotiating strategy of the administration to get the attention of the Chinese. So our big problem with the Chinese is not their selling subsidized steel or subsidized aluminum to the U.S. That does hurt American companies in those industries, but It also helps consumers who use that lower cost steel and aluminum, and it helps those industries in the United States that use the lower cost. But what's the real issue with the Chinese? The real issue is about so-called technology transfer. So, I don't know, about 5 years ago, the Chinese were very actively using their cyber skills to infiltrate American companies and transfer out technology of all sorts. And when they were confronted with that accusation, they would say, no, 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 we don't do anything like that. But finally, the U.S. government decided to confront them with the evidence. And so when President Obama met with President Xi in California, I think in 2013, he had the evidence calculated or collected by our National Security Agency, which is a very sophisticated cyber organization. So we were able to say to President Xi, you say you're not doing it, but we can tell you who's doing it. We can tell you on what frequencies they're doing it, and so on. And so the Chinese said, okay, we didn't realize that, but we won't do it again. So they promised that they would stop having the People's Liberation Army, which was doing it, or other government agencies in China steal technology from American companies. Now, we can't be sure how much of that has actually worked, but my sense is, from talking to people, it looks like that's been somewhat effective, maybe even better than somewhat, very effective. So now the loss of technology is taking a different form. American companies that want to sell or operate in China are told often that they have to transfer some of their technology to Chinese firms as a condition of getting access to a market of 1.3 billion people and a GDP that's about the same as that of the United States. Companies don't like it, and they also find that not only are they required to transfer technology, but often before they get a license in China to use their own technology, the Chinese firms to whom they've transferred it have already started to operate and have established market share. You can't take this to the WTO. So it's just not, it's, quote, voluntary. And so how to deal with it? I think the administration's strategy is going to be to say, well, we've got some nasty things to do to you, but if we can get you to stop this policy, then we won't do those nasty things. So I hope I'm right about that. We will not have a trade war, we will not have high tariffs, and we will get less so-called voluntary technology transfer.
Very optimistic for 2018. So thank you very much. That's all the time we have. Please join me in thanking Martin Feldstein.
Thanks very much.
And you are welcome to stay and mingle for another half hour for our networking reception. Thank you very much.